Radio Loma Linda, where no listener is ever left.
Some of the methods to provide additional ways of identifying types of problems and solutions. Scarcity may be analyzed using concepts of shortage and results, indicating difficulty satisfying needs and overuse of the population of resources. You're listening to the Business and Sustainability Hour on KCAA Radio, AM 1050. Our next guest is currently an Associate Director of Water UCI at UC Irvine. As we continue celebrating Women in History Month, today is Dr. Shannon Robach. Hi, Dr. Robach.
Hello, how are you doing today?
We're doing good. We're happy to have you with us.
I'm happy to be here.
So, what is Water UCI?
Sure. Water UCI is a center at the University of California, Irvine. We facilitate research, we do water education, we do public outreach so that the public can learn more about the most pressing water issues of our time, and we can work with professors and water agencies and governments to come up with solutions to these problems.
That's great. So what does it mean by interdisciplinary?
Sure. So we're an interdisciplinary center, which means that we have people from all different backgrounds who are working on these problems together. Water is a really interesting area because you have people who are looking at water economics and people who are looking at water law. You have chemists who are looking at chemical contamination in water. You have biologists who are looking at bacteria and viruses. So it's an interesting field because almost any expertise or any discipline can find a home in water. And if we want to solve these really big problems of water pollution or drought, we really need to bring together groups of people who have different backgrounds so that we can solve these problems, because they're very difficult problems to solve for just one type of person, like just a chemist or just an economist.
And it makes sense to invite people to and encouraging them to be a part of it if they, have some type of way that they can help.
Yep, that's what we like to do. We really like to bring people together at the center, bring together the best and the brightest to tackle these really, really important problems.
Yeah, I agree. So technology is critical to keeping fresh water available to meet everyone's needs, with a limited supply to 1 in 9 people worldwide who lack safe drinking water. How do we get to this point where we don't know the quality of our water?
It's a great question, and there's a lot of different reasons that most people don't know the quality of their water. But I think really it all comes down to just public education. This information is out there. So, water districts, where you pay your water bill, every year they're required by law, by the Environmental Protection Agency, to provide you as a customer something called a consumer confidence report. So every year, your water agency has to make this available on their website. They may send it to you in the mail. And basically it will say, this is where your water is coming from. This is how we're treating it, if they're doing any kind of treatment. And if there are any pollutants in that water that are at levels that are higher than allowed by the Environmental Protection Agency, they would have to let you know in that report. So there's a little table that shows you a little bit about your water quality, but even if you get access to this report, it can be really hard because you're looking at this table and you don't know what these chemicals are, and there's a lot of jargon. And so even though there's a law requiring this sort of public disclosure, if you don't have a background in science, and even if you have a background in science, but you don't have a background in water and water quality, it can be really hard to understand what this stuff means. So I think more than anything, it's a public education problem. Water agencies and EPA have a pretty good idea for what's in the water. It's just they are pretty bad at communicating. Not all. Some are really good at communicating. disorientating. But in general, it's a tough problem.
I would say so. I mean, it's just you. I mean, how would we know? I mean, yeah, I mean, you're getting these consumer confidence reports, and it sounds great, but maybe, like you say, maybe not everybody understands what it means.
Exactly. And, the words that are used are words that you aren't using in your daily life. And so, what are you going to do? You're going to go on Google and you're going to try to start looking this stuff up. And then you're going to come across even more jargon. And then, it's going to get even more confusing. And you end up, kind of in a situation where even though you're getting some information, it's not presented in a way, or there's not enough information to, really answer the questions that you might have. You might come away with more questions than answers if you don't have a background in this stuff, which most people don't.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your history in your studies. Uh, Currently, you're the associate director at Water UCI. So, what is your role? I mean, what do you do there?
Sure. So I work with the director to manage all aspects of the center. So I come up with new ideas for research. I build teams to pursue those projects. I come up with new ideas for education programs. So whether that's at UC Irvine or at local middle schools or high schools, teaching students about drought in California and water conservation. And I also organize our public outreach programs. So we have a community speaker series where we bring in experts to talk about all kinds of different water problems. It's open to the public. People can come to the university and see these talks, or we also record them and post them online on our YouTube page. And we cover all types of things. We've talked about fracking in water. We've talked about desalination plants and water. We've talked about diversity in the water sector. We've talked about drought and climate change and water conflicts, water wars. So we try to, really get all of this research and all of this information out of the university and to the public in ways that are easy to understand so that everyone knows a little bit more about their water.
That's very nice. So the EPA just announced some chemicals that are pretty much everywhere that may also wind up in the water. And they want to eliminate them from the products where they are in use the most. It's a long-lasting chemical, widely used, and they want to remove it soon. Is it something to consider these forever chemicals, as they call it, could in fact cause or may be linked to modern society to a range of health effects, and why?
Yeah. So there was recently EPA made an announcement that they were going to create a regulation for a group of chemicals called perfluorinated compounds. For short, we call them PFAS. For even shorter and an easier way to understand, they've been called forever chemicals, which is a really good name for them because they don't break down in the environment and they accumulate in humans and other animals. So they're not the only type of chemical like this. Historically, there have been other chemicals that don't break down in the environment and accumulate in humans, things like DDT and chemicals like PCBs. And we typically call these persistent pollutants. And they're really dangerous because, again, they don't break down in the environment, so they stay there forever once they're there. And then when they get into our water or they get into our food, they're stored in fat cells, and so they can slowly accumulate in us and cause a wide variety of health problems, from reproductive health effects to cancer to immune dysregulation, and all kinds of different health problems. So when EPA is making regulations for our water or our air, these are the kind of chemicals they worry about, these persistent chemicals or these different types of these forever chemicals. So the chemicals that, are most at risk of getting into us and causing health problems. Those are the ones EPA really focuses on when they're making regulations. So we're very happy that they have made this decision to regulate these perfluorinated PFAS compounds in drinking water, because that means that your drinking water provider will have to test the water regularly, and those chemicals will have to be below a certain level, or else the drinking water treatment plant will face penalties, and they'll have to notify you, and they'll have to make improvements to their treatment system in order to remove them. So these chemicals have been around for a few decades. It's a very good thing that EPA will now be regulating them in our drinking water.
And I recently heard that Michael S. Reagan, the administrator of the EPA, said the government intends to require near zero levels of those chemicals that you just mentioned.
That's right. So the levels are very, very small. I believe they're 4 parts per trillion, comes down to like a drop in the size of a swimming pool amount. But, the thing to remember with these chemicals is that even at low concentrations, they can have health effects. So when EPA is setting these limits, what they do is first they assess the toxicity of the compound, and they create a health advisory level, which is a level that would be considered safe. So EPA would say, okay, at this level in water, if you drank this for your entire life, you would not get cancer, you would not have reproductive health. This will be the safe level. And so that level that EPA determined last year was 0.004 parts per trillion. Now, the level that EPA is deciding to regulate PFAS in drinking water is 4 parts per trillion. So it is quite higher than the health determination. And this is pretty common with drinking water regulations. And that's because in order to get to these really, really low concentrations, we may not have the technology to treat the water to that level, and we may not even have the technology to measure the chemicals at that level. So this is definitely a step in the right direction, and having a maximum contaminant level for drinking water for these perfluorinated compounds is great. And hopefully, as our technology improves and our ability to measure these chemicals improves and our ability to treat the water improves, we could even set a lower level. That would be, closer to a level that we would expect no health effects. So it's definitely a step in the right direction, but there's always room for improvement.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a new federal drinking water standard in the United States for those that are just joining us. I guess it hasn't had very much momentum in the last few decades, as you mentioned. So is it a little bit overdue, you think, or is it just something that's very nice to have now that we have it?
No, it is very overdue. I'm very happy that this is here. This stuff has been in consumer products for decades and has been released into the environment for decades. And because it doesn't break down, it's not going anywhere. It's a really, really good thing that we finally do have this regulation in drinking water. Unfortunately, environmental regulations are typically slow to be enacted for a variety of reasons. EPA is not the most funded agency in our government. Under any administration, EPA is not first in line for funding. And so since its creation in the 70s, it's sort of continually had cuts and cuts and cuts. And so when you do that, it makes it just very hard for the folks who work there to do their job of, regulating new chemicals in drinking water. So unfortunately, this isn't the only group of chemicals that we know is out there and has health effects, and we would like regulations for. But again, that process is just really difficult to do when you have overworked, underfunded agency.
Right, and I think it's just you're looking at one little thing when there's several. So, I
Yes,
mean, you have an estimate that will cost water utilities a lot of money annually. So, is this something that they're going to be able to fix with the money that they already have, or is it something that they are putting aside money for just for this one problem?
that's a great question. And we are very lucky that this is coinciding, perhaps intentionally, with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill in the beginning of this presidential administration, which the passage of that bill is providing money specifically to water agencies to deal with contaminants like PFAS. So there will be forgivable grant money and loan money available as part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill to water agencies to help them upgrade their systems in order to remove these chemicals. And what's really great about this is that when we talk about water treatment technology, all of the water coming out of your tap has gone through some kind of a treatment plant, and it's gone through some kind of filtration, probably some kind of chemical treatment. And so when you upgrade a treatment plant in order to help it to remove these PFAS forever chemicals, those upgrades will remove other chemicals as well. So when you upgrade this process, as this money is made available for agencies to upgrade their treatment plants, this is not just going to increase the removal of these forever compounds, it's going to increase the removal of other compounds that aren't regulated as well. So it's, money for infrastructure in the drinking water and wastewater sector is extremely well spent because, this is our water, right? You've got to drink it in order to live. Most bottled water, a huge portion of bottled water is just tap water that's been, through maybe one more stage of treatment so that it doesn't have that chlorine odor. And so, these kinds of investments in infrastructure, just have huge implications for the health of our country. Drinking water treatment is one of the biggest public health interventions that saved more lives than things like vaccines and other modern medical interventions. So investments in our infrastructure for cleaning air and cleaning water just saved countless lives. So this is really, really positive that there's going to be money made available to improve these treatment systems across the country.
And it's great that they came up with this just last year. I mean, this was something that they were already anticipating that they needed to do. So it was a big package that went through Congress, and they gave them the go-ahead, the EPA, as a part of that infrastructure bill. That's really nice. And it was great that they had that.
I agree.
So the regulatory failure, we can go on circle around. Would you say that goes hand in hand with the manufacturers who created the chemical, knowing that they had it?
It's very tough to regulate chemicals in the United States. We obviously have a framework for, keeping chemicals out of water, keeping chemicals out of air, but we still have to produce these chemicals, and that has to happen in factories. There are, accidents that happen and things are released. There are allowable releases of chemicals into air and water. These consumer products, they end up in landfills, and those landfills can, the chemical, as things break down, the chemicals leach, and that leachate, we call it, the sort of water that's coming from those broken down products in landfills, all of that makes its way back into our water. And, all our water is going to be drinking water at some point. So it's tricky because, if we want the comforts of modern technology, these PFAS compounds were really popular for a reason. They were originally, one of their main original uses was in nonstick cookware, and nonstick cookware was a huge and extremely popular advancement for anyone who cooked. And so, they were also very commonly used in things like Scotchgard and anything that was used to waterproof materials. So the properties of these PFAS compounds make things like water and oil not stick to them, and that's a really nice property to have for a chemical. So we have a delicate balance between developing chemicals that do improve our lives while also making sure that those chemicals don't make their way into our food and our air and our water as much as possible, and that we do provide regulations that protect the public, whether that's for air or water or during the manufacturing process for these consumer products in terms of, what can actually be in a pan and what can actually be in Scotchgard. It's a very difficult thing to do because we have about 80,000 chemicals in use in commerce in the United States today. Only a couple thousand have been tested for toxicity. It's just a lot of work. We have modern chemistry making our lives easier, but also, just a lot of things to try to evaluate and to kind of be on the lookout for.
Yep. We're here with Dr. Roback on the Business and Sustainability Hour, and stay with us. We'll be right back.
The Business and Sustainability Hour is on the air.
KCAA Radio has openings for 1-hour talk shows. If you want to host a radio show, now is the time. Make KCAA your flagship station. Our rates are affordable and our services are second to none. We broadcast to a population of 5 million people. Plus, we stream and podcast on all major online audio and video systems. If you've been thinking about broadcasting a weekly radio program on real radio plus the internet, contact our CEO at 281-599-9800. 281-599-9800. You can Skype your show from your home to our Redlands, California studio where our live producers and engineers are ready to work with you personally. A radio program on KCAA is the perfect work from home avocation in these stressful times. Just type kcaaradio.com into your browser to learn more about hosting a show on the best station in the nation, or call our CEO for details, 281-599-9800.
The Business and Sustainability Hour is on the air.
So we're back and with Dr. Roback from UCI, and this is the Business and Sustainability Hour. Welcome back to our listeners. Let's see. So the federal government announced that it would have those two chemicals removed from drinking water. And we mentioned before how it's found in everything, that's waterproof clothing and a few other things. Do you have experience in your study removing toxic chemicals?
Yes. So this was a big focus of my doctoral work and work that I continue to do, which is working with water treatment plants to develop treatment solutions for removing all kinds of chemicals. So like I mentioned, there are a number of toxic chemicals, and our water infrastructure in this country is pretty old, just like our bridges and our roads and much of our infrastructure in this country. And so it just really wasn't designed to remove these chemicals because they didn't exist at the time that a lot of these treatment processes were originally developed and are still being used in many places across the country. Obviously, it varies a lot in different communities. We have communities where there's a lot of money from the tax base, then there's more money for the treatment plant there. If you are in a small community without a lot of tax dollars, then you're going to have probably smaller and older water treatment, and it's probably going to result in more water problems. And so, this is also an environmental, we call this environmental justice or environmental equity problem because, the quality of your water will be tied to the amount of money in your community to a certain extent. And so if you don't have a lot of money in your community, it's more likely you're going to have these problems because you just won't be able to afford the fancier treatment.
Yeah.
So my research is aimed at, improving water treatment plants to get rid of all of these chemicals, and also studying things like these inequities and trying to figure out how we deal with them by recognizing that everyone has the right to safe and clean water.
We had a gentleman here that spoke about that being the new civil rights. I mean, the right to clean water. And I can't remember exactly how he put it, but it's like this was something that was pretty amazing to hear. And I'm very intrigued to hear about people when they're talking. It's just something I thought I might bring up.
Sure. And, these are things that, we see, occasionally in the media, things like Flint, Michigan, where we saw a big failure of the water system there and exposure of children and families to lead, which is quite toxic, especially to children. But Flint is not the only town in the country that's dealing with this. There are a large number of communities that are dealing with not just lead, but all kinds of other problems, including tribal communities, which tend to have a lot of water problems because you can often find tribal communities situated next to environmental hazards like mining operations that have been shut down. And so it's quite common across the U.S. And in other countries that you have these serious environmental problems and water problems in communities that don't have the financial resources or the political capital to advocate for, safer, cleaner water or to pay for safer, cleaner water. It's really quite unfortunate. I can say, though, that in recent years there's been more awareness and a number of groups who are working to combat this problem and make sure that everyone in our country has clean and safe drinking water, including EPA, who just recently announced a number of positions they'll be hiring to focus specifically on environmental justice and helping these communities kind of improve their infrastructure so that all Americans can say, my water is safe.
Right. And it's good that you mentioned, too, that these chemicals pose a problem for wildlife. I know that was basically what you were getting at when you were saying other communities. So, I mean, it's just, the environment is somewhat important to the people that live there. And they're, I guess, a little bit concerned about what's going on around them.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's funny because I think a common misconception with the Environmental Protection Agency is that the role of the agency is to protect the environment, which makes sense because that's the name of the agency. But really, the EPA is a public health agency. They are worried with protecting air and water for humans. So, EPA is not really concerned with making sure that, bears are, have clean water. It's focused on making sure that humans have clean water and humans have clean air. That's really the primary mission of the EPA. They do some work, making sure that, fish can survive, but oftentimes that's linked to fish as a food source for humans.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at, like the food source
Yeah.
for human being fish and coming out of water. So it's just one of the things that I thought about, which is the reason I mentioned it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, wow. So you have environmental sciences, PhD. How is it to be a scientist?
I love being a scientist, mostly because I have way too many questions. And so it's nice to be in a job where I get to try to find answers to those questions.
Yeah.
I also, I want people to be able to live a happy and healthy life and to do what they, enjoy. And so in my personal research, it's really centered around trying to get at these problems so that we can make sure that everyone's water is safe and, that they can not have to worry about that.
Yeah, for sure. So we get a good picture of your research. What about your work developing interventions and strategies with regional water agencies and community organizations?
Sure. So I have worked both with and at times in my life as an employee, a variety of water districts around, in California primarily, because that's where I have been for my entire life. And so, most of that work involves identifying a group of chemicals that we know are toxic and then figuring out how to get them out of the water, figuring out how they got in the water, what is the source and can we control the source? And then if we can't control the source, how do we treat that water so that by the time it goes out the pipe and goes into someone's home, that chemical is no longer there, or it's at such a low concentration, it doesn't cause any health problems. So there's all kinds of new innovative water technologies using things like UV light at high intensity to break chemical bonds and break chemicals apart. Really innovative things happening in places like Orange County Water District, which operates the largest water reuse plant in the world, where they take wastewater and run it through very advanced filters and use this UV technology to break apart chemicals, and they actually end up with a water that's cleaner than many types of bottled water and other tap water. And so they are sort of a research leader and an industry leader, very focused on research. So there are a number of agencies in California who not only produce water for people, but also have research teams who are constantly trying to find new technologies or alter the way that existing technologies work in order to make that water cleaner and safer.
Well, understanding chemicals is something it's probably past them to try and even understand a little bit. But for me, just the average person, when I think about chemicals getting in water, I think about you're at the gas station and you spill a little bit of that gas, and it happens all day. So how does this not get into your water? I mean, this is just basically something to where it will probably dry up a little, but maybe also keep going to where it finally winds up in your water.
Yeah, the answer is it does get into your water.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and especially after it rains. Everything on the ground, right?
Okay.
Things get on the ground, whether it's at a gas station, whether it's in an agricultural field with pesticides or fertilizers or manure. Whenever it rains, all that stuff is going to wash out, and it's going to wash into the nearest lake or river or stream. And those are our sources of drinking water. And that's why tap water is all treated. That's why we have these treatment plants that treat tap water, treat bottled water to get this stuff out, because it's very difficult to prevent it from getting in. We have to grow crops. We have to use gasoline for our cars. There are interventions at all of these levels to try to prevent this stuff from getting into the water in the first place. But there's just so much, there's so much pesticide applied. There's so much fertilizer applied. There's so many animals being grown for food and so much manure. We just can't keep it all out of the water as best we try. So we have to have the treatment processes there that, where the water is collected to remove as much of that as possible, which again is why investing in infrastructure is really so important, because we want the best filters and the best water treatment that we can get.
Very nice. So I like I said before, I get caught up sometimes with exciting people, and it's great to have somebody talk about themselves like you are today. But can we ask you, is it something that you've planned most of your life to be a scientist, or is it just something that prompted you to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always kind of liked math and science growing up. And when I got into college, I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to, what I wanted to do with that. I was actually a surfer, and I was noticing that, there was a lot of trash in the ocean in Los Angeles when I would surf, especially after the rain. And I remember hearing, oh, well, you can't actually go in the ocean for 72 hours after it rains. And I was very curious as to why that was. And I learned that it was because bacteria that is on the street washes off when it rains and goes out to the ocean. So bacteria from animals, from waste. And so obviously if you swim in that, when it washes out after the rain, you can get sick. So there's a general rule that you're not supposed to go in the ocean 72 hours after it rains if you live in a city. And it really interested me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that I was in such a hazardous environment that could impact my health in that way. And so I started studying environmental health, and I eventually transitioned into drinking water quality because, sure, some people get sick from going in the ocean after it rains, but there's not that many people who go into the ocean, especially after it rains, and everyone has to drink water. So I thought, well, maybe that's a bigger problem to work on that will, potentially can help more people if we can, develop good solutions. So I kind of transitioned to focus on drinking water in graduate school, and then that's where I've stayed ever since.
Well, I'm glad we got to discuss a little bit about the history behind it, or in your case, the herstory, women's history, herstory, if you get it. So, I would have never known that you couldn't get into the ocean 72 hours, after it rained. And, you probably don't hear that, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll take a quick break again. And we're here with Dr. Roback, and we'll be right back. Thank you again.
The Business and Sustainability Hour is on the air.
KCAA Radio has openings for 1-hour talk shows. If you want to host a radio show, now is the time. Make KCAA your flagship station. Our rates are affordable and our services are second to none. We broadcast to a population of 5 million people. Plus, we stream and podcast on all major online audio and video systems. If you've been thinking about broadcasting a weekly radio program on real radio plus the internet, contact our CEO at 281-599-9800. 281-599-9800. You can Skype your show from your home to our Redlands, California studio, where our live producers and engineers are ready to work with you personally. A radio program on KCAA is the perfect work from home avocation in these stressful times. Just type kcaaradio.com into your browser to learn more about hosting a show on the best station in the nation, or call our CEO for details, 281-599-9800.
Would you like to mention anything of your contributions and business ventures, or is there anything that you'd like to mention, that anything else you set out to do that you thought about?
It's a good question. I don't have really any business, I'm not, I don't really have to sell anything.
Mm-hmm.
I would say if this is, if you're interested in these types of issues, I would encourage folks to check out our Water UCI website. We have a lot of good information there. If you just Google Water UCI, UC Irvine. There's all kinds of interesting tidbits on our website if you kind of want to learn more about water and water issues. If you wanted to attend some of our in-person events, we do a water career fair. So if you're a student or even someone who's just looking to transition into a new career field, the water sector is in need of people. It's what's known as a graying workforce. Many of our water agencies and treatment plants were built back in the 70s when EPA was created, and so there are a lot of folks who are retiring, and we need people to join the water workforce. And like I mentioned earlier, there's room for everyone. There are public affairs people in the water sector. There are HR people in the water sector. There are economists. There are biologists. There are sociologists. So, and most of the water sector jobs are pretty well paid because they're public agencies, so they typically have good benefits. And so it's a really good opportunity if you're interested in this stuff. We do have a job board on our website, but, kind of check out your local water agency. There's a need for people who are interested in these issues to, join the water workforce and, help us to improve drinking water for all of our citizens.
Very nice. The Water UCI website is where you get that information, and quite a bit. You can just basically check your local water agencies. That's great. Mm-hmm. So your work addressing the needs for those in underserved communities, would you like to elaborate a little bit more? Or?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm doing work in a couple different areas right now. The main one is looking at water quality on tribal lands in California. So there are close to 200 tribal lands in California, and only a handful of them have drinking water regulations. And so what we're trying to do right now is understand what the environmental challenges are in tribal lands. Tribal communities have some really big health disparities compared to non-tribal areas in California, with higher rates of things like heart disease and diabetes and cancer. And there are a number of different reasons why we might be seeing these health disparities. And so our goal in this research is to try to understand whether or not water is one of those reasons, and whether the water in tribal lands basically has more pollutants than non-tribal lands, less pollutants than non-tribal lands, or the same amount. So I'm doing work with tribal lands, and then we're also doing some work mapping sources of pollution in South Central Los Angeles. There's a lot of industrial area of Los Angeles County where there's been historical businesses, so businesses, that were there 50 years ago or 70 years ago, before we had EPA. And before we had EPA, it was kind of the Wild West. You had manufacturers literally just digging a hole in the ground and dumping chemicals into that hole, and it would just drip down through the soil right into groundwater. And so many of these contaminated sites exist in industrial areas of Los Angeles and other industrial areas of the country. And since the businesses aren't there anymore, oftentimes those sites have just been paved over. And even in cases, things like parks have been built on top of them. Even if that contamination in the soil is not fully removed. And so this is called, these sites are called Superfund sites. EPA has what's called a Superfund program, which keeps track of these industrially polluted sites. EPA tries to get the companies that polluted them to pay for the remediation, but it can be difficult because sometimes they've gone out of business because it was so long ago. And again, EPA just doesn't have a lot of money to do the cleanup itself. So we are doing a project mapping Superfund sites in South Central Los Angeles, and then mapping that to water quality in those areas and the consumer confidence reports provided by water agencies to get a sense for whether these contaminated sites are impacting the water in these sort of industrial places of Los Angeles.
So these consumer confidence reports, are they also available in tribal lands or no?
It's a great question. So it depends. If you are a tribal land, you have an option to be what's called treated as a state. So basically, if you're a tribe and you wanted to adopt EPA's water quality regulations, you could fill some paperwork out, assuming that you can afford and hire the lawyers to fill out all the paperwork, and you would say, we want to be treated as a state, and we want to be able to adopt water quality guidelines. So in California, I believe there's 12 tribes that have this status, and if they have that status, and if they've been if they were treated as a state and were adopting these guidelines, then yes, they would have consumer confidence reports.
So if they didn't, I don't really want to even go there, but what would you say is essential to know about how to make these, a little bit less harmful if there are chemicals present?
That's a really good question. I think really the key here is, we can try to treat the water. We can spend billions of dollars updating our water infrastructure all across the country. But probably what would be more effective would be to try to stop this at the source. So, for example, if there is a company who creates a new chemical, we want to make sure that this new chemical, that the world has not seen before, is not toxic before we allow it to be in a nonstick pan or in a jacket or in carpet. And so the regulatory process for assessing whether new chemicals that are created, whether those are toxic to human health, we just do not have a really good process for that in the United States. We're very lenient, and we allow a lot of self-reporting. So, we'll allow, companies to tell us whether or not things are toxic. And there's just, that's a tricky set of incentives for a company if they are trying to make millions of dollars off of a new chemical to then say, oh, look, we just spent, $20 million in R&D to develop this new chemical, but we figured out it's toxic and we just want to let you know, and we're not going to produce it. I'm not saying it doesn't happen,
right.
But it's not really the best process for regulation, and it's kind of like if we ask people to just let us know if they were speeding. I don't think many people would be calling the cops on themselves.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a weird system where, we're allowing a lot of self-policing of, kind of industries, that we wouldn't really allow a normal person.
It might be safe to say that it's a way that they tailor it to their own needs for their own business.
Yeah, and of course, as a business, your goal is to make good non-stick pans, right, and get that out there.
Yeah.
And so, that's what you're going to try to do. And so, ideally, the goal of, an agency like EPA or, the FDA or any of these agencies would be to make sure that these things are safe. And so I think if we could strengthen those agencies and strengthen some of our regulations, if you look, for example, at the European Union, there are many more chemicals that are banned from use in consumer products in the European Union due to safety concerns than we have in the United States. They just are a bit more stringent in allowing potentially toxic compounds to be used in those countries. And so I think if you have that, it just makes it a little easier to deal with these problems.
Okay, so what's important to you in your work and studies?
It's really just, making sure that like I said, people have safe drinking water. That's really my primary goal. I just want to make sure that everyone has access to affordable, safe, clean drinking water. And whether that's in the United States or, any other country in the world, I think everyone deserves safe and clean drinking water. And so all of my research efforts and my educational and public outreach efforts are centered around that goal.
Right, and having it for years to come is so important as well.
Yeah.
So there appears to be a dependency on chemicals, though. I mean, many of those materials in everyday life. Is it safe to assume that there may be a replacement that's less harmful?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good assumption. That's what's great is that, chemical producers, have very smart people working for them who are developing new chemicals. And so 100%, I believe that we could be making, safer chemicals. And there are efforts to do this. There are things like green chemistry where, people are trying to make chemicals that are less toxic or chemicals that do break down in the environment more easily. And so this is an area where investment would be great, if we had, philanthropists or the government who said, we really want to invest in green chemistry. We want to pay companies and pay scientists to come up with less toxic alternatives with chemicals that break down in the environment. That would be a fantastic use of, money that would pay off in reduced healthcare costs and a lot of heartache.
Well, I mean, healthcare is one of the reasons people don't even go to school nowadays, I hear. It's just, they're having one of those issues where it's just clean water. I mean, we're back to where we started at square A again. So, I mean, it would be nice, I guess, too, to have something that will be able to break down a lot easier in the environment. And it is a green approach, and philanthropists and a few things that you mentioned there are very nice, along, hand in hand with healthcare. So about your students, how do your students interact with you when you're doing your duties or, testing quality, or what is it? How do they interact with you as their professor?
So my students, and I mean, I'll do the same thing for your listeners now, which is say, kind of apologize. I feel that I have to recognize that I'm the bearer of a lot of bad news, unfortunately.
KCAA is your CNBC News affiliate. We're the station that gets down to business. The Tri-City Shopping Center in Redlands